This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we're going to speak with Paul O'Connor, the Senior National Officer at the Public and Commercial Services Union, or PCS. The union represents workers in many government departments in the UK, including the Home Office and border guards and these kind of things. The union, along with Care for Calais, recently wrote a policy on safe passages for refugees. It's a genuine humanitarian way to stop the small boat crossings into the UK, and it's a way of giving visas to people who are already in Europe so that they can come to the UK and safely without having to risk their lives crossing the channel. So Paul is going to tell us all about that. We'll also talk about the current UK asylum-seeker policies and the way that the government is treating asylum seekers and people on the move. Paul tells us why the union got involved in this and how border guards and Home Office staff feel about the way that the government is treating asylum seekers, migrants and people on the move. We also talk a bit about working class solidarity, anti-fascism. We talk about the Bibby Stockholm, which is that boat that is off the UK shore where the government is trying to house asylum seekers, which is pretty disgraceful. We talk a little bit about the hostile environment, and we talk a bit about how the government or previous governments have created this backlog of asylum seekers applications. This is why there are so many people trapped in military bases or in hotels or on the Bibby Stockholm ship. So yeah, we talk about a lot of stuff in this episode. It's a really great interview. So before we get into it, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, it's also a website with news reports, interviews and investigative stories. You can find out more about that if you go to civilfleet.com. Again, I haven't updated it for a while, but hopefully within the coming weeks I'll have time to do that. If you like what the Civil Fleet is doing and you like our grassroots journalism and you would like to help us to continue to platform the activists, the refugees, the trade union officials now, journalists and all the different types of people that we've had on this podcast, if you'd like to help us to continue to do that, then you can make a small donation or a huge donation if you like. You can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet. That's ko-fi.com/civilfleet, and you can make a donation there. Our costs on the Civil Fleet are really small, but any help that you can give us will be greatly appreciated. Oh yeah, one more thing before we get on with the show. If you're not from the UK, you may not be aware that the Tories, or Tory, is a nickname of someone who is a member or subscribes to the ideas of the currently ruling party in the UK, the Conservative Party. Anyway, that's enough from me. Let's get on with the show. Shall we get started with the podcast?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Paul O'Connor from the PCS. I think you're the Senior National Officer at PCS, the Public and Commercial Services Union. Thank you so much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Pleasure.
It's really good to get someone from a trade union on the podcast. To my other work, the Morning Star newspaper, we have very close links with other trade unions. It's really good to get someone from one of the trade unions on the Civil Fleet. We're going to talk today about PCS's safe passage visa policy and the work that you've done with refugees and this kind of thing. But before we start talking about that, I wondered, Paul, if you could just give us a bit of your background and tell us a bit about the PCS.
Yeah, in terms of my background, Ben, I started work as a civil servant in what was then the Inland Revenue back in 1988 and quickly gravitated into trade union activity, and I was on the shop floor there for nearly 20 years, representing members in a range of roles from local rep up to group executive committee level. I then became a full-time officer of the union in 2007, working as secretary to the PCS Home Office Group. And then in 2010, I was promoted to national officer and subsequently to senior national officer in 2012, where I've served since as the union's head of bargaining and secretary to its National Disputes Committee. And I also have oversight for strategic litigation on behalf of the union, which is how I became involved in the safe passage stuff. In terms of PCS, we represent somewhere in the region of 190,000 members across the UK, mainly organised in the civil and public services. So all of the major departments of state, and also in a range of arm's length civil service bodies. But we also have some public sector non-civil servants in our union as well, and a private sector arm, which is primarily covering areas of the civil service that are being farmed out to the private sector. We've transferred over to continue to represent those members. So that's probably enough about me and a bit about the union.
And what got you? Because I saw you. One of the reasons we're doing this interview today is I saw you speak on a panel at the World Transformed Festival last week in Liverpool. Last week, as we're recording, it's October the 18th at the moment. So yeah, and where was I going with that? I saw you speaking. Yeah. So do you? Yeah, I saw you speaking on this panel about refugees, and I wondered if you have any sort of personal connection. Like, why did you get involved in that, or is it part of your role to get involved, or I don't know. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your sort of connection with asylum seekers, refugees, and these kind of
Yeah. I suppose I've always been acutely interested in the issue. Having been involved in anti-fascist work as a youngster and coming through the ranks in the union. And also seeing the system from the inside when I was a full-time officer looking after members in the Home Office group. So I always had that level of interest in what was going on with asylum policy. But really, I came to the issue in earnest as a result of our members approaching me and raising the issue with me. Because I've got the oversight for strategic litigation, our branch in Southeast England approached me and asked if there was anything we could do when Priti Patel ordered a pushbacks manoeuvre on refugees in the English Channel in the autumn of 2021. Essentially, our members were horrified at the prospect of carrying out that manoeuvre. They were clear that it was very, very dangerous, that a fatality was likely to result if it was carried out. They said that they didn't think the Home Secretary had the power to carry out the manoeuvre under existing legislation. They said that in their view, it breached several articles of the European Convention on Human Rights. But most importantly, they thought it was morally reprehensible and utterly inhumane. And that's the Home Office's own staff who were making those representations. So that's how I first came across this issue in earnest. Our response to that was to join forces with a couple of refugee organisations, Channel Rescue and Care for Calais. And we lodged judicial review proceedings to try to get the High Court to declare the policy unlawful and get it quashed. After the Home Office ducked and dived for about 6 months, hiding behind disclosure, hiding behind issues of national security, on the eve of the hearing, a week before the hearing, they wrote to us out the blue saying they were withdrawing the policy and they were offering to pay all of our legal costs, which is as near as damn it an admission from them that you were going to win in court. And Priti Patel obviously didn't want the political blowback on that, having put so much political capital into it. So that's how we come to the issue in the first place. I mean, I'm happy to go on and talk about what subsequently happened with Rwanda, Ben, if this is the appropriate time.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Can I just say, just for people who are listening who don't know, Priti Patel was the former Home Secretary of the UK. So, and she's like, I think in other countries it's often referred to as the Interior Minister or Secretary of Homeland. I can't remember what it's called in the state. I'll put a link in the notes. But yeah, that was her role. And we've also had Care for Calais on the podcast and Channel Rescue. So I have links to those episodes for anyone wanting to listen. But yes, please, can you talk about the Rwanda scheme? Talk about the sort of the situation in the UK for asylum seekers at the moment.
Yeah, so we initially took that litigation in respect to the pushbacks manoeuvre for two reasons. One, we were clear that it was our job to protect and promote the interests of our members. And our members were clear they didn't want to work in a hostile environment, and they certainly did not want to be carrying out manoeuvres which could potentially kill people. But we were also clear that we were doing it to stand in solidarity with refugees who were being subjected to that type of inhumanity. So when we secured that victory, we thought to ourselves, job done. We've looked after our members, we've looked after the refugees. Nobody's going to drown as a result of any manoeuvre carried out by Home Office staff. But no sooner was the ink dry on the sealed order from the court than the government announced its madcap Rwanda policy. And I say madcap because it is a scheme that's just masquerading as a serious approach to asylum and immigration, because it's not serious. The government has already paid the government of Rwanda £140 million. Not a single refugee has gone to Rwanda. And in any case, they've only got capacity to take 200 in the first tranche. So the idea that this acts as a deterrent in the way that the government says it does is just cloud cuckoo land. It's nothing but performative policy making. So once again, we joined forces with a couple of refugee groups, this time Detention Action and Care for Calais. And also, I'm proud to say, 8 individual refugees who themselves had their asylum claim declared inadmissible under the new Rwanda policy, and they were earmarked for deportation. We took that case to the High Court. The High Court, in its first stage decision, said that the policy was lawful, which was obviously a disappointing outcome for us. We then lodged an appeal to the Court of Appeal, and I'm pleased to say that the Court of Appeal overturned that first stage decision and said that Rwanda is not a safe country to send refugees to. And the Supreme Court has now heard a further appeal on that from the government, and a judgment is expected probably in about 6 weeks' time. So we think whatever the outcome of that particular hearing at the Supreme Court, it's inevitable that one party or another will appeal the matter further to the European Court of Human Rights. And we're hopeful that ultimately the European Court will decide that it is an unlawful policy and it's not safe to send people to Rwanda. And actually, it's a total abrogation of this country's responsibilities under the Geneva Convention. And we think it's really important as a matter of international law that that convention is respected. And it's particularly acute at a time when the world is increasingly turning into a war zone in a number of areas. And some of the inhumanity that we're witnessing going on at the moment can only be called to account and prevented by having an international governance system. And we think any attempts to undermine that results in catastrophic consequences for the working class at large.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Like, I think you're right to call the Rwanda scheme a madcap scheme. It's totally crazy. Just like, for people who don't know, I think Suella Braverman now, who's the Home Secretary, I do know that. She, she's really pushing this through. She wants to take asylum seekers who come into the country illegally and send them to Rwanda, which is just mad. We've had a few episodes on this on the podcast, but just whatever you think about it, like, because Rwanda's got its own problems, got lots of like issues that it needs to work out. It's not like a rich country like we are that can handle these people and look after them. And also, it's something like, I can't remember this, but it's like a really high percentage of the asylum seekers that cross the channel are genuine, right? They're the Home Office or whoever finds them to have a genuine case for asylum. It's really high. So sending them to Rwanda is just awful, totally unnecessary. And like you said, it's cost us so much money. And the current Conservative Party is supposed to be, keen on saving money, public money, and not spending anything. We just don't like spending it on the working class, I think. But anyway, what about the Bibby Stockholm? Have your members, for the Bibby Stockholm is another crazy scheme that the government has come up with, where they want to leave asylum seekers on a boat because they have been keeping people in hotels. They have which are in not great condition anyway. They've been leaving people on military bases and this kind of thing, right? And now they want to keep them on a boat that has had lots of problems, which is called the Bibby Stockholm. Yeah, Paul, if you could tell us a bit about that, or what your members think, or your personal thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a consequence really of a backlog in the asylum system and cases not being processed quickly enough to allow people to settle in this country, become productive citizens, and work for a living. They're currently banned from doing that while they're having their asylum claim heard. What that means in terms of consequences is they're constantly living in temporary accommodation, hotels. It's difficult to find decent accommodation for them. And the government's ways for dealing with that is, rather than putting in more resources to clear the backlog and allowing people to settle and become productive, they've now organised the spectacle of sticking them all on a barge. Now, if a kind interpretation of that is that they're under pressure for accommodation, so they need to do something. An unkind interpretation, which is probably the one I favour, knowing this government's approach to asylum, is that they just want another spectacle where it gives them the opportunity to demonise refugees. And of course, the reason they want to demonise refugees is to deflect from their catastrophic failings to look after the citizens of this country in terms of their living standards. So that's why the Bibby Stockholm has become an issue. We don't actually have members directly operating on the Bibby Stockholm, but certainly the fire brigade union do, in terms of checking it out for health and safety and assessing risk of fire. And of course, if that barge were to go on fire, it would be the members of the fire brigade union who would be at the sharp end of that, and whose lives would be under threat in those circumstances. The fire brigade union has described the Bibby Stockholm as a death trap. So that tells you something about the conditions that people on that boat are being forced into. But I'm really proud of the work that we've done defending refugees and our members through the courts. And I'm also really proud of the fact that it appears now to have set a benchmark for the trade union movement in Britain on these issues, public policy issues, because the Fire Brigades Union are now in touch with our lawyers who represented us in the Rwanda case. And the matter of Bibby Stockholm is now going to judicial review with the Fire Brigade Union as a claimant. And I think are going to back the Fire Brigade Union all the way in terms of their judgment about just how unsafe those conditions are. But the really pleasing thing for our union is to see other unions coming on board, realising the gravity of the situation, realising that it's in our class interest to defend our members and defend them alongside defending the interests of refugees, because both of those groups of people have a common oppressor in that regard.
Yeah, that's it. Like, I agree, and I think most people listening to this podcast will agree that it's not just activists and people involved in refugee rescue or people interested in that, but it's also a trade union thing and a class thing. Like, can you talk a bit about, like, maybe you've said this already, but why PCS got involved in this particularly, or why it's a trade union? Maybe that's a better question. If you talk about why it's a trade union issue, refugees and supporting.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it's a trade union issue for two reasons. First of all, the Home Office under successive governments has been trying to build a framework for refugees in this country, which is increasingly hostile, and it's got progressively worse under every administration, and I include Labour governments in that analysis as well. And where that's left our members who work in the Home Office is that they're constantly doing their jobs in an atmosphere of hostility. They are constantly used as a political football by politicians of all political hues, who, when something goes awry with the Home Office through no fault of our members, there's no politician stepping up to take responsibility for that because of their appalling policy making. It's increasingly our members who are the ones who get kicked, and they're sick to the backseat of it. And running alongside that, they have witnessed a drop in their living standards due to pay restraints across the public sector over the last 13 years in particular. That's seen their living standards fall by 20%. So they are suffering quite acutely from a cost of living crisis. And they are making the connection between that and the government's agenda on the demonisation of refugees. What it's about, Ben, is not stopping the boats. The Tories want the boats to continue to come across, otherwise they would adopt our policy on safe passage. And the reason they want that to happen is they want the spectacle of it. They want to be able to say ahead of the next general election to the UK population, the reason that your infrastructure is crumbling, the reason that your hospitals are not getting built and repaired, the reason you can't get your kid in a local school, the reason your living standards are falling, is not because of us. It's because of all these refugees coming across in boats on the scrounge. And it's obviously completely untrue. But because they've got no other serious policies to put before the population, and because their catastrophic failings on living standards are just becoming increasingly obvious, they have to create this smokescreen to deflect the blame onto refugees. So that's why we believe it's a trade union issue. We believe that our class needs to understand that that is the government's game, and that as a class we shouldn't let them get away with that narrative. The truth of it is that we are poor because the government's policy making makes us poor. It's not the fault of the refugee, and it's our job to stand in solidarity with the refugee to say to the government, no, we're not prepared to entertain that. And what we want is a society which looks after everybody, whether they're an existing citizen or people fleeing for a safe place. And given we're the sixth richest economy on the planet, that is eminently doable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's something that the way you said there reminds me of. There's like a phrase that people often use, like the enemy doesn't arrive by boat, they arrive by limousine or something like that. That's reminding me. And like, it's really, well, I really enjoyed when I heard when you were talking, you're talking in this podcast now, and what you said, the world transformed thing that I saw last week. Was that it's good to know, because I feel like a lot of the spaces that I work in, or in this podcast, I often think of the Home Office as the enemy. Like I'm like going through with FOIs with them all the time, like it's bouncing back, and it's just a constant battle. But it's good to know, that there's members there's people there who are members of your union and members of other unions or whatever, and they disagree, and it must be quite a hard. Is it a hard line to walk? Because I know civil society servants. I know civil servants are supposed to be neutral, but yeah, I don't know. Can you kind of explain any of that? Like, is it a tight walk? Is it a hard thing to do, or like it doesn't seem to me? It seems like you should be easy to be able to talk about this.
Yeah, it hasn't always been an easy thing, and I think if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, we might have been in a very different situation in terms of where we were in our conversations with our members about it. But I think for those reasons I've outlined, Ben, about the creation of the hostile environment in which they have to work, the trauma that they go through in doing their jobs, the horrific things that they see, and the attack on their living standards, it's enabled us to make an argument over that 15 years with our own members that, look, it's not the refugees are the problem here. It's the government, and it's the government's policies which are making your lives a misery, both in work and out of work, in policy making and in living standards as well. So we have found, as we've taken this litigation, a very, very receptive audience in terms of the Home Office workforce, who've been cheering the union on for the work that we've done, and the fact that we've stopped these horrendous policies to date. And I think when you reflect upon the fact that it was our ordinary members in the Home Office who came to us with this, it was the people who work on those cutter vessels in the Channel. They turned to their union and said something needs to be done about it. You get from that this is a tale of ordinary workers doing extraordinary things, and I'm really, really proud of the stance that our members have taken. And I'm not overblowing it when I say, when the history of this comes to be written, I think members, people who read that history will look back on our members and lionise them in the same way they did with the Rolls-Royce workers in Glasgow who refused to fix fighter jets to go to Chile to aid and abet Pinochet's coup. That is the type of stand that has been taken here, and it follows in the proudest and best traditions of the working class and the way they can engineer change.
Absolutely, you're making my hair stand up on edge here talking about that kind of thing. Yes. Let's talk about your PCS's safe passage policy. So my understanding is that if you're an asylum seeker and you try to get to Britain, or you need to get to Britain, you you've got no way essentially of getting here apart from getting to Calais or Dunkirk or somewhere like that along the north coast of France, hoping to find someone with a boat and then coming across and hoping to survive the journey. Which many that I don't think that there's been a few tragedies, but not much. But that's the situation, right? And so, what's the? Maybe you could talk a bit more about the situation and then the policy and why it's needed.
Yeah, I mean, the litigation has been fantastic in terms of rolling back the government's worst excesses on asylum policy. But we've concluded that it's not the answer. And what asylum in this country needs is a longer term strategy. And ultimately, we believe that longer term strategy has to be a dismantling of the hostile environment framework because it just doesn't help anybody. I mean, the amount of money that the Home Office spends on constructing a hostile environment, if people just imagine for a moment if that money was turned on its head and was used to aid refugees coming to this country to settle, get homes, get schools, get hospital access, get jobs, become productive taxpayers, citizens, there's the path to growth in the economy, isn't it? And when people say, "Oh, yeah, but we've got to control numbers," I mean, the truth of it is that there has been no hard-headed assessment of what migration numbers are required in this country, and we currently have an absolutely massive staffing shortage in the National Health Service.
Mm.
So to be turning people away in that scenario is just crazy. We think that hard-headed analysis needs to take place, and a sensible, rational assessment needs to be made of how many refugees and migrants that we take in and how they can contribute to the economic life of this nation. We think that the safe passage policy that we produced is a step change towards that, and we want to use it to begin to change hearts and minds on the issue. But we also think it is a standalone solution to a specific problem of people making those dangerous journeys. Because where we agree with the government is that those journeys need to stop because they are life-threatening, and desperate people will always do desperate things when they're trying to get to a safe place of safety, when they're fleeing all manner of war, terror, persecution, and oppression. So we have written to the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office and to the Home Secretary, furnishing them with a copy of our pamphlet on the issue. And we've said that this is the answer to the small boat crossings. What our policy does is allow people who are in Europe to go to a visa centre, go through an asylum screening process, and if they have a reasonable prospect of getting asylum in the UK, which incidentally 75% of those who make those small boat crossings do, and that's in a hostile environment, then if that screening process says you've got a reasonable prospect, then they will give you a visa to travel safely to the UK by plane, train, boats, whatever. And nobody would then have to make that dangerous crossing over the channel. And in one fell swoop, you would destroy the business model of the people smugglers who are exploiting people and making lots and lots of money from this. So if the government was serious about it, it would adopt that policy. That they don't adopt that policy tells you all you need to know about what the real game is. As I said earlier, it's about creating a deflection from their failings on people's living standards and demonising refugees in the hope that people won't lay the blame at the government's door.
Yeah, and like it's. Yeah, I think I agree with you. I do agree with you about the government. It's not really within their interest. I don't think they want to stop the boats, apart from that being the slogan. They just want the slogan, and they've used it in the last like 3 or 4 elections, right? To stop the boats or stuff about refugees, and as if it's a huge problem, which is in my life and everyone I know. I don't think refugees, even asylum seekers, refugees, whatever, migrants, are not the issue. It's the fact that I can't book you can't book a hospital appointment, costs shitloads to pay. You can swear on this podcast, by the way. It costs a lot of money for my bills, this kind of thing. Those are my problems. It's not some guy from Iraq.
That's right.
Anyway, I think I was reading in the policy stuff that you had that World Transformed. Um, um, the UK government has actually done a similar thing, right, for people from Ukraine, from Hong Kong, and from Afghanistan. Although I think the Afghanistan one has stopped. I'm not really sure now, but so your policy is kind of similar to things that they've already actually done, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that this system is tried and tested. They've done it for refugees from Ukraine, and they've done it for refugees from Hong Kong. And you have to ask yourself the question, don't you? Why is it good enough for people from Ukraine and Hong Kong, but not good enough for anyone else? And of course, the answer to that, I think, lies in whatever they think their geopolitical strategic interests are at any given time. They consider Ukraine and Hong Kong to be their friends because Russia and China are not their friends. And anyone else who doesn't provide a strategic interest of that nature, they're not really interested in and are happy to demonize them. So I think that's what's at the root of the inconsistency. But there's no question that this system works. We represent members in the Home Office, and it's those members who have the vocational expertise to design these systems and tell us whether there's any flaws in what we're proposing. And they have pored over this with a fine-tooth comb, and they tell us that it is absolutely a workable solution. So it is really, really disappointing that this government won't adopt it, but we're not giving up. We're going to continue to campaign on it, and we'll obviously be campaigning in advance of a general election next year to try to get an incoming administration to adopt it if there is a change of regime.
Yeah, well, that's something that you talked about. You mentioned a little bit in this podcast, and you talked about the trade at the TWT thing. So, what's the? Can you talk first about the government's response to the safe passage, the safe passage visa policy, and also the Labour Party? I don't know if the Lib Dems, the Greens, or anyone else, but can you talk a bit about um, how the government and then the other opposition parties have responded or reacted to the policy?
Yeah, the Tory party will come is no surprise to you to know. I've just dismissed it out of hand, and they sent us a stock response in relation to our proposal, which listed all the things they say they're doing on asylum and trying to dress that up as progressive steps, when in actual fact, the reality is completely different. In terms of our work to try to get it adopted in the parliamentary arena, we have been working with MPs across the political spectrum to get them to row in behind an amendment to the recent so-called illegal migration bill that went through Parliament. Unfortunately, we couldn't secure the backing of enough MPs in order to support that amendment for safe passage, so it didn't feature when the bill was finally published. Our focus, Ben, for now is going to be trying to get the Tory party to adopt the policy. We have no great expectations that that's ever going to happen in advance of the next general election, because it's the battleground on which they want to fight it. We have been in discussions with the Labour front bench. We've explained in depth what our policy entails. We've lobbied them to say this is the solution to the problem of the small boat crossings. There are some quite progressive noises that Labour has made that we would welcome. First of all, they've said they will employ over 1,000 additional caseworkers to help clear the backlog quicker, which helps our members, helps alleviate the pressure that they're working under day to day, and also helps refugees who need a quick asylum decision so they can get on with their lives and, as I say, become productive citizens able to work and make a contribution to society and develop their own well-being. So I've made all those points to Labour, and disappointingly, Labour has refused to come out in support of safe passage, although they have referenced it in respect of children and people who already have a connection to the UK. So we're hopeful that once they come into government, they will revisit the issue. But we think it's inevitable that they will have to revisit the issue anyway, because it is the only workable solution that anyone has produced to stop the small boat crossings. billions and billions of pounds are being poured down the drain with deals with France trying to crack down on smuggling gangs and millions of pounds sent to Rwanda. None of it has acted as a deterrent. People are still making that journey, and they're making that journey because there are no safe routes that exist for them to get across. Our document gives them exactly that. So when a Labour government comes into power, if it does at the next election next year, we intend to revisit the issue with them and to be explaining to them, look, this is the only workable solution. And you are still going to be faced with tin pot racists like Nigel Farage jumping up and down on the beach, pointing at people coming across in dinghies. If you don't want that sort of aggravation, then you can make the issue go away simply by adopting our safe passage policy, and that's where they need to be.
Yeah, I think the Labour leadership, I can't remember what they said now, but recently, not so long ago, I think they wrote about their policy in the Sun newspaper about what their things were, and then I think Starmer and Yvette Cooper were in Brussels to talk about it. I can't remember what they said, but I remember being really disappointed by it at the time, by their policies. And so, yeah, and you mentioned this already, but your members have reacted because they were involved in drafting the policy, right? They're happy with the policy and think it's going to work, right?
Yeah, as I say, Ben, they're the people with the vocational expertise, and they deal with the whole gamut of asylum and immigration in the UK. We've got people working out on the cutter vessels in the Channel. I mean, incidentally, their jobs are essentially to be customs officers. They should be chasing down drug smugglers, people bringing in contraband, people smuggling, people ferrying arms into the country. That is the job of the people on those cutters. Instead of doing that job, they're spending every working hour lifting people off small dinghies in a very, very distressed state in order to ferry them back to a place of safety. So, they're the first sort of port of call. When people arrive at the shore, they then go to a processing unit, which again is staffed by our members. Their claims are then sent on to be heard or to be deemed inadmissible, or whatever the Home Office does at the material time with them. And they're referred to our people in the caseworking and policy end of the operation. So you can see, sort of start to finish, we have people doing the full range of duties in terms of the administration of the asylum and immigration system. And it's those people who have poured over this document and tell us it is the solution. So we've made sure they've had a hand in it to ensure that it's workable.
Yeah, that's really good. And it's I'd not really thought about BCS members or members of a union being involved in this, but it's clearly like it's all your members are having to deal with this, right? As they're at the forefront, the front lines, if you want to use that term, of like of the situation, right? They're seeing the people, they're rescuing the people from the water, bringing them in, putting them into the centers or wherever they go. So yeah, it's obvious that why you would want to have, why your members would want to get involved in this and want to solve the problem, right? We've mentioned a few times the backlog. I just wondered if you could, because from what I understand, the government have made it really, they've created a real mess of the backlog of asylum seekers in the country who are waiting to have their decision on whether they're allowed to stay or not. And it's really long, right? I think people are waiting for years. Could you sort of talk about this and the effect of it, sort of in more general terms?
Yeah, it's a legacy, Ben, of what I've referred to earlier about politicians of all political hues using our members in the Home Office's political footballs and using the entire issue of asylum and immigration as a political football. What they need to do is sit down, make a hard-headed assessment as to the country's immigration and asylum needs, and to come up with a plan that creates a system and a framework that facilitates that happening in a swift, efficient manner. Instead, what they do is, one, lurch from one policy crisis to another as they react to whatever the week's media headlines are on the matter. And two, consistently implement cuts programs across the public sector, which slashes the number of jobs that are available for people to do this work. And of course, what you get from that is crisis management backlogs building up left, right, and centre. And what the Home Office is been doing every few years is laying off loads and loads of people as a result of those cuts programs, and then realizing it hasn't got enough bodies to do the work. So then it recruits loads and loads of people to clear the backlogs. But of course, when you've lost all that previous experienced caseworker operation, it takes time to train up new people, and it just does nothing to effectively manage the backlog. It's just all based on short-term thinking. What it needs is a longer-term plan to get people into the country, get their asylum claim properly considered by caseworkers who are not under political pressure to find one way or the other. And when that claim is granted, if it is granted, to help those individual refugees then go out, get jobs, get settled in communities, and just get out and have a safe, happy life, which at the end of the day is all anybody wants.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I'm going to come to my last question, but my last question is about the future and this kind of thing. But I just wondered, was there anything else you wanted to add, Paul? Like, anything I didn't ask you about the policy or anything about PCS or the situation that we're in? Before we go to the last question, was there anything that you wanted to add or I should have asked?
No, I mean, I'll come to the future in a minute, but I think we've probably covered the ground quite comprehensively there, Ben. If I think back over the exchanges we just had, I think we probably made all the points that we need to make. I just want to reiterate, this is the only workable solution to stopping people making that dangerous crossing. We want to convince as many people as we can that that is the right thing to do, because it's that upward pressure amongst our class and in our communities which will convince politicians to make the change at the end of the day.
How can anyone listen to this podcast? How can they help the policy? I'll have links to where it is, but how can they? What can they do?
Yeah, they can do little things like talk to their friends and family about it, because that's how you start to change hearts and minds. You can take the argument out into community groups. You can take it into your workplaces, get your trade unions to back the documents. We as a union are happy to go anywhere, anytime, any place to go and talk about the issue to either groups of workers or to people out in communities in order to win that battle for hearts and minds. So that's the first thing people can do. The second thing people can do, Ben, and there'll be a link to this in the stuff that no doubt bang out with the podcast, is they can contact their MP and they can ask their MP to support the adoption of safe passage as a policy. It's been a bit of a cynical exercise for MPs in the past about just writing to constituents, fobbing them off. But when it gets nearer to a general election, I think members of the public tend to get more of an acute hearing when they contact their MP. So there's a sort of window of opportunity here between now and the next general election to really win hearts and minds, but also to get politicians on side with the policy.
Yeah, I think that's a good things to do, right? Is to put pressure on other people to make sure that it comes out and spread the word. I hope the podcast is some way towards that. So my last question then, Paul, is about the future and sort of how you feel. I always ask people that come on the podcast how they feel about the way the situation is going. I know in the UK we've got the Illegal Immigration Act, I think it is now. The Strikes Act. We've had a lot of authoritarian policies coming into this country. So it feels really dark to me about the way activists can and help people, can help refugees and people on the move and this kind of thing. But yeah, so the big question is how do you feel about the future of what's happening here with refugees, asylum seekers, and people on the move?
Yeah, I think the picture can be quite dark if you look at it from the perspective of what's happened over the last 50 years on policy making in Britain. As I said, the approach to asylum has got progressively worse, and it's no accident that that's happened in correlation to a massive drop in living standards for people in this country that has happened since 1979 and the election of the Thatcher government. So in the context of the pursuit of 50 years nearly of neoliberal economics, you can see how you can get quite down about it and think, oh, there's no hope, this is it for the rest of our lives. I personally don't think that's the case. And I think because things have been so bad as they have for the last 50 years, that things have to change for the better and people will begin to demand better. And what also gives me hope is if you look at the polling on this issue, younger generations of people have a more progressive outlook on the issue of asylum and immigration and the entire issue of race than perhaps older generations do. So I think there is a certain inevitability about a shift in the landscape. I also take heart from the fact that this country has a demographic aging crisis, which people haven't quite woken up to yet. Now, I don't take heart because we've got that as a crisis. I take heart because one of the consequences of that will inevitably have to be a more progressive approach to the issue of asylum and immigration as people more and more come to realise that we need immigrant labour and we need immigrant labour to look after people in their dotage, and that is one of the things that is going to have to happen. But I also caveat all that by saying none of these things happen by accident. It's not enough to just sit back and wait for the inevitable crisis to unfold and then try and deal with it. I think we have to be proactive as a movement and be on the front foot making the argument about why a more progressive policy is the right thing to do, both in the interest of the refugees coming in, but also in the economic interest and welfare of people who already live in this country. Because if we haven't got a sufficient population to sustain the infrastructure we currently have, then it has catastrophic consequences for our own class in those circumstances. I think the final thing to say on the future, Ben, is that climate change is going to be a massive issue when it comes to considering migration. In the southern hemisphere, there are terrible consequences on the horizon to climate change. And I think this country has to be doing two things. One, all it can to decarbonise and to make a just transition, shift more and more workers into jobs in green energy to help us make that transition. But also really think about what the consequences are for migration in the southern hemisphere and start an international conversation with other countries about how that's going to be managed. Because one of two things will happen. We either manage that process properly and we bring the entire human race to a place of safety, or we suffer a very, very dystopian future where gunboats patrolling the channel and blowing people out of the water. And I don't think that is a situation anyone with any shred of humanity will countenance. But like I said, progression doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people bandy together and make it happen. So there's a sort of closing message that I'd like to give to your listeners. It's do all you can to force that progress, be an agent of that change, and we can change things. And I think if we all do that and we get our tactics right and we get our approach right, I think in a decade's time, we will be in a very, very different environment from the one we're in now.
Well, that was a really positive message there at the end there, Paul. Thank you very much. I agree. I think, change doesn't happen without without people, normal people, and just working people, they don't have to be politicians, whatever. If you don't demand stuff, then nothing changes, right? We've seen this with like so many issues, gay marriage, women's rights, everything. Yeah, great. Well, Paul, that was such a good interview. Thank you so much for your time. I think you've got to rush off to another meeting. I've got to get back to packing and moving house. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Paul. Ben. It's been a pleasure. Good luck with the move.
All right, that was episode 49 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to Paul O'Connor for coming on the show, and thanks to everyone at the PCS Union. If you like what the Civil Fleet is doing, then you can help us cover the costs of our grassroots project. You can do that by going to co-fi.com/civilfleet, and you can make a small donation there. You can donate as much as you like or as little as you like. Our costs are small, but any help would be greatly appreciated. If you don't want to do that, don't worry, you don't have to. I know times are hard, no one's got any money, including myself. Then you could just share the podcast around, let people know about it. Let's tell people about the situation and what's happening to migrants. It's really terrible. And hopefully this project, the Civil Fleet podcast, is some way to improving the situation and getting more people to know about what's happening. All right, I think that's it for now. Hopefully I'll have an episode again pretty soon. So I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.